The last review topic I want to talk about before going into section 4.1 is rationalizing a denominator. And basically what that is if you look at this example we're about to do, where you have 2 divided by the square root of 68, when you're in math, it is usually customary to not only simplify your square roots as we've been doing, but also if you have a square root in a denominator, we want to get rid of it. Okay, the square root, we prefer it to be in the numerator, not in the denominator. So the whole process of removing the square root from the denominator is called rationalizing the denominator. Okay, so I'm going to show you how this works. Let's go up here and read really quickly, and then we'll work on the example. Okay, so up here it says when a fraction has a single term, which just means single piece, in the denominator, and that term is a radical, the process of rationalizing the denominator can be used to eliminate the radical from the denominator. To rationalize the denominator, multiply both the numerator and the denominator by the radical in the denominator. All right, so in example R3, it says to rationalize the denominator and simplify. Okay, all right, so what I'm saying is, okay, if you are stating an answer and your answer is going to involve a square root, you have to make sure of 2 things. One, the square root needs to be simplified like we've been doing. And then secondly, if the square root lives in the denominator, you need to rationalize the denominator and move the square root to the numerator and get it out of the denominator. Okay? All right, so here we go. 2 divided by the square root of 68. First thing you should notice, okay, more than likely the square root of 68 is going to simplify. Okay, I'm going to do that secondly. I'm going to first rationalize the denominator, and then I'll come back and see if the square root simplifies. Okay, it does not matter whether you rationalize first or simplify the square root first. It doesn't matter. It will come out the same. My preference is just to go ahead and rationalize the denominator and then simplify. Okay, all right, so what we're going to do, okay, we are going to rationalize the denominator, we are going to multiply both the top and the bottom by the square root. So we're going to multiply by the square root of 68 over the square root of 68. Okay, this is not changing our initial quantity. The initial quantity is 2 divided by the square root of 68. You cannot change that quantity. Okay, by multiplying by the square root of 68 over the square root of 68, anything divided by itself is 1. So we are really multiplying the original quantity by 1. So it's changing nothing. Okay. All right, so let's see what this does for us. Okay, so we have 2 fractions that we're multiplying together, so we're just going to multiply across the top and multiply across the bottom. So the numerator is going to become 2 times the square root of 68, and in the bottom, the square root of 68 times the square root of 68. Well, we just talked about this. If you take a square root and you multiply it by itself, or that's the same thing as squaring a square root, you're just going to get left with the number that's underneath the square root. Okay, all right, so we have essentially rationalized the denominator, okay, by doing this little step where we multiply the original quantity by the square root of 68 over the square root of 68. Now the square root is out of the denominator, it's moved to the numerator. Okay, so in our next step, we're going to work on simplifying the square root of 68 if we can do that. Okay, so I'm going to go over here and try to make a factor tree. All right, so 68, we need to figure out, how this thing breaks down. So start running numbers through your head and figuring out what divides into 68. Okay, if you play around with it, 4 times 17. Okay, that's one pair of numbers that works. 4 times 17 will give you 68. Okay, and just keep trying to break numbers down. 4 will break down into 2 times 2. Okay, 17 doesn't break down any further. It just breaks down into 17 and 1. Okay, and then in your next step, the 2's don't break down, so we're done. Okay, so circle your numbers at the ends of the branches here. Okay, so the square root of 68, okay, is going to be the same thing as the square root of 2 times 2 times 17. And again, always check yourself. 2 times 2 is 4, times 17 is 68. Okay, so now we're going to go and look for pairs. We have a pair of 2's. So I'm going to circle the pair, scratch them out. One of the 2's will come outside of the square root. Okay, and the 17 is not paired up with anything, and so it just stays underneath. Okay, so the square root of 68 is the same thing as 2 times the square root of 17. All right, so now that we've simplified our square root, let's return to where we left off. Okay, in the numerator, we already had a 2 there. Okay, so I'm going to leave that 2. Okay, and then the square root of 68 is the same thing as 2 times the square root of 17. Okay, so now that's our numerator. In the bottom, we still have 68. Okay, all right, so what you can do in the numerator, you can multiply the numbers outside of the square root. 2 times 2 is 4, okay, times the square root of 17. Remember, you cannot send that 4 through the square root. It has to stay outside. The bottom is still 68, okay. This is going to reduce because 4 does divide into 68. Again, 4 and 68, you cannot combine those with the 17 in any way, shape, or form. You cannot put either of those numbers through the square root, okay, because they themselves don't have a square root with them, okay. But if you just looked, this is really, maybe it'll help you to think of it this way. This is really 4 divided by 68 times the square root of 17, okay. This is the same quantity because you can make anything a fraction by putting it over 1. So you can take this quantity and write it as 4 times the square root of 4 times the square root of 17 divided by 68, okay. This fraction, 4 divided by 68, reduces. 4 goes into 4 one time, 4 goes into 68 17 times, okay. And so now if we multiply across the top and across the bottom, 1 times the square root of 17 is the square root of 17, and then 17 times 1 is 17, okay. This is our answer, okay. Not only have we rationalized the denominator, but we also simplified the square root, okay. And you can check yourself, okay. Look at the calculator, okay. Remember, what was our original quantity? It was 2 divided by the square root of 68. I'm going to go pop that in the calculator, and then I'm going to put in the simplified version. You should get the same decimal approximation, okay. Let's go check it out. All right, so the original quantity is 2 divided by the square root of 68, okay. There's the decimal approximation, okay. And then we calculated that this can also be written as the square root of 17 divided by 17, okay. So let's see if we get the same decimal approximation, because if we do, we know we did this right, okay. Make sure that when you're done with a square root on your calculator, you exit it. Okay, so I'm out of the square root. Now I can divide by 17. Okay, I got the same decimal approximation, so I know I did this correctly. Okay, all right, so there you go. Okay, this, they really are, at the end of the day, these quantities are the same number. Okay, 2 divided by square root of 68 is the same thing as the square root of 17 over 17. Okay. Don't think that 2 divided by the square root of 68 is incorrect. It's not, okay? It's still a number. It's that decimal approximation you just saw. It's just customary in math that when you're working with a square root, you simplify the square root and you rationalize the denominator if you need to, okay? All right, let's move on to section 4.1.